And this is my second year with Maine Coastal Islands. My first year on Metinic though.
And I'm Becca, and this is my first year out at Maine Coastal Islands.
The island was acquired in 1994, and in 1996 they began staffing the island, and in 98 they began using social attraction, which is these lovely little decoys. And so between the decoys and the speakers, they were able to slowly start to attract the tern colony. And as of this year, we have another record high and have roughly 1,200 pairs of terns nesting on the island. And so that's a combination of Arctic and common terns. Or about the species?
Yeah, so we have 2 tern species nesting here. We also sometimes see the federally endangered terns. And here, I'll lift this up to give you a bit of a view of the island. Yep, and so there's our tern colony out that way, as well as the rest of the island here. And so, yeah, and so we occasionally see the federally endangered rosy terns, which are which have this blood red bill, the common tern, which has a more orange bill. Other differences in the terns, the how do you turn? Other differences with the terns is that the common terns breed all the way along the coast of the eastern US, while the Arctic terns were kind of one of the more southern breeding areas. They breed mostly up in the Arctic Circle. And when they migrate, the common terns will fly down to Argentina and Chile, while the Arctic terns do one of the longest migrations of any species on Earth. They fly a round trip route that's around 25,000 miles long from the ones breeding up in the Arctic Circle, go all the way down to the Antarctic Circle. Ours, since they're breeding further south, quite the trip. And both of the tern species are pretty long-lived. The common tern, the oldest one on record, was 25 years old. For Arctic terns, they've had one on record that's 34 years old. Those trips quite a few times.
So with that little intro, getting into the colony and talk more about what we do here on the island. So this is our lovely walk to the colony that we make. It's not too long, which is pretty nice, pretty quick access. So in case there's anything wrong, we can easily get there and solve the problem. So within the tern colony, there's several things that we monitor and study. So for one, we monitor general productivity. And so with the productivity, we set up little pretty much corrals, for lack of a better word, which we'll take you guys to. And with these corrals, we will basically monitor a subset of chicks to see how they're doing. So we'll measure their weight and wing chord daily. So this allows us to measure the growth and see how the species are doing. We also will monitor provisioning. So at the provisioning, we'll sit in one of our lovely blinds. So we have 5 on the island, but we'll sit in the blinds for 3 hours and watch around 5 or 6 nests. And from there, we will see what prey items are being fed. So we know each each nest is differentiated by a different Sharpie color. And so we typically will get a Sharpie and we'll color others, not harm them. It basically is just a way for us to tell the difference between the different species or between the different individuals. So the A chick, which is the first hatched chick, will get colored on the top of its head. The B chick, which is second hatch, gets colored on its like area. And then the C chick, a third hatch chick, will get colored on its back. And so we're able from that to see who is getting fed and know what they're getting fed. So where you have some terns flying, even a couple fledglings flying out of the plots. And so since we have two species here, we also want to know the ratio of common terns to Arctic terns. So at the beginning of the season, we marked nests with red or blue flags. The red flags are common terns and blue or Arctic terns, and blue flags are common terns. So there's a couple fledglings out of one of our plots. So here you can kind of see the netting and the material that goes around. So let's see if we can find some chicks for you guys. Oh, one in the corner. Oh, Becca's got one. All right, so Becca here has a common tern. And so for our common terns, they get a single leg band. And then if we have an Arctic tern, they also get a second band that's field readable. So Becca, do you want to talk about the bands?
Yeah, so this band here is a BGL band. It has a 9-digit number on it that is unique to this bird. It works like a social security number. It goes into a national database, and that way anyone else who catches this bird for the rest of its life, they'll report that data, and it goes and it connects with what else we know about this bird. And so the one downside to these bands is that a lot of the band reciting we do from the blinds with scopes. And so if we saw this bird from the blind, we'd have to wait until we read all 9 of those numbers to be able to report that we saw it, which is a lot of numbers to read. So the field readables on the Arctic terns are really helpful because they make it so we only need to read 2 letters and 2 numbers, and they're as unique of identifiers as that 9-digit BBL band.
Andreas is currently trying to see if he can track down a bird with a field readable, and so far no luck in this plot. Oh, that guy was not part of the colony. Well, we may not have, seems that all of our Arctic terns from this plot have fledged, which is great news. So can't complain there, but you can kind of see, you might be able to see some of the red versus blue flags. And so another thing that we'll do is, aside from banding all of the chicks in the productivity plots, is we will band any chick that we can find on the island. So we'll see if we can find an unbanded chick who we can band. And so
but I can only do it on the phone. I can't get this on.
And so with once they have a wing chord greater than 60 millimeters, we can measure their tarsus, which is their leg bone, and we can determine if it is a common tern or an Arctic tern. So a common tern will have a tarsus greater than 19 millimeters, and an Arctic tern will have one less. So Andreas has found us a bird that we'll see what it is.
Okay, so first thing we want to do when we try to ID it is we want to make sure its wing chord is greater than 60. Obviously his is way greater than that, 150. So from there we can go into measuring the tarsus.
So an unofficial way that you can tell is almost do a personality test, which commonly more aggressive and fidgety, and Arctic terns are generally very calm, but that's not always the case. So
this guy's 17.6, so that makes him an Arctic.
So since he's an Arctic tern, he'll get both that 9-digit BBL and the field readable. Need a hand? Hey, Becca, will you help him with the banding?
There you go. And in the bag.
And there goes the pliers.
He's going to be 50260.
And so we always want to put the BBL band on the right leg, and we do that for all species here on the island. And so with these banding pliers, there are different size holes for different size bands. So we use this third hole for the BBL, and then this fourth hole we'll use for the field readable, which is a larger band.
Field readable. I'm not sure if y'all can see that very well. It's TB 54. I like the bite, but it doesn't hurt very much. Well, at all, really.
Oh, and that poor guy just regurgitated his breakfast. So this guy kind of fails the personality test. He's slightly more aggressive than the typical Arctic tern, which is why it's not sound science. They're just hanging out on the ground.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit already about the flags that you see around here that are the red or the blue flags, and we ID'd those by sitting in the blinds, first marking them with a white flag and then seeing what species came and sat on those eggs. But obviously we don't have the time to do that with every nest in the colony. And so from there, we mark a certain number of them by region. The entire island we have on like a grid system. And so we know what grid like how many flags are in what grid. And from there, we then do a census count where we basically walk those grid lines, count every nest we can find, and using the ratio that we've already determined of nests that we've identified, that's how we get our final numbers for how many common terns are nesting here and how many Arctic terns.
I think I want to say this year for our species ratio, it is 55% Arctic terns or 56%, and then 44% Arctic terns. Or you said Arctic terns. 46% Arctic terns and 56% common terns. And so a lot of times, kind of where we are, we'll have a lot more Arctic terns nesting in the rocky areas. and then common terns in the more grassy regions of the island.
Yeah, Arctic terns have those very short legs, so they're really not that good at walking in vegetation. If you ever watch one, even just going over the rocks, they trip a lot, and so they tend to stick just to the bare rock where it's easier for them to move around. Yeah, so does anybody have any questions about the terns or about what we do here with the terns? We have some other species on the island that we study as well that we'll be moving into next. So if you have a tern related question, now's a great time to ask it. You can put it either in the comments or just say it aloud.
Yeah, I got a question. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, so with all those birds being on the ground and whatnot, what's their greatest threat to survival? And then also, like, what's the predator community like on the island?
So probably one of the biggest threats that they face alone is exposure. So when they're younger, they're able to hide underneath their parents and still get incubated. But once they get a little bit older, they get too large to fit underneath the parents. And so they're left either hiding in veg or under artificial structures that we make for them, whether out of rocks or little wooden teepees, which I think we have. You might be able to see over there. There's a little wooden tripod tent. So we have those kind of artificial structures. And then in terms of the predator community, so we have gulls that nest on the island as well, and they can pose a threat to the terns. And unlike a lot of the other islands in this area, we actually have garter snakes on the island. And so the garter snakes can eat the eggs or young chicks. And so we actually have several snake traps set out on the island, little minnow traps. And so from there, any snake that we catch will be collected by refuge staff and brought back to the mainland.
Yeah, one of the benefits for the terns for nesting on this island and the other species that nest here is that there aren't any native mammals, which really helps to lower the number of potential predators. And that's actually like one of the reasons that these species do nest on islands like this. It's a way to avoid predators.
Awesome. Thank y'all.
Caitlin, a lot of them seem to be getting really close to the camera. Are they really getting that close to you guys' heads?
Yeah, so I'll change this zoom around and step back and look at Becca here. She'll be our show off. But yeah, we'll actually during plots, especially Andreas and I with our larger hats, even Becca's had it a couple times. We'll actually have adults that will come in and land on our heads and kind of just check us out and make sure, trying to figure out what we're doing. But yeah, they will get close, and the common terns will actually full on make contact, and they hurt a little bit when they hit you. Sometimes it's with the bill and sometimes it's with the foot, so it really just depends. But yes, they do get that close. They're very protective parents, at least they try to be.
Is that white stuff on you what I think it is?
If you think it's poop, I have it probably the worst. If you think it's poop, that's correct. So this refuge recommends bringing what are called poop shirts. You can see on my hat. And so basically it is clothes that you're okay with getting pooped on, because you will get pooped on a lot here on the island. I think I saw a question about eggs. Where did the chat go? Here we go. So Jim asked, how long did it take to get from egg to hatchling to fledge? So the eggs usually take about 21 to 23 days of incubation before they start to hatch. And then from there, it kind of just depends on how many siblings they have and how effective their parents are at feeding. So this is an egg. This egg, unfortunately, probably will not make it this season. It may have just been either a dump nest or its siblings hatched and it didn't. We have here, this is a full club yet. And so we have some chicks that are around 20 days or so that they're starting to fledge. Other ones will take a bit longer. But for our research purposes, we say around, like, if they make it to at least 15 days, a lot of times there's a greater chance that they'll fledge. So if we have a chick from one of our flocks that manages to escape and get away, if it's at least 15 days old, we'll consider it fledged. Are there any other questions about terns from anybody?
I just was wondering about, the mortality rate on the island, and then if they're tracked and their bands are monitored so that you know how much of that year's fledglings have survived.
Caitlin, could you hear that?
So with the productivity plots is a great way for us to kind of monitor that exact thing that you were asking about. So we obviously can't monitor every single chick across the island. So with the productivity plots, I think we have 9 this year, and we're monitoring around 85 nests. That's about, I think it's a little bit heavier on the common tern side, but this allows us, like, across the island to see, like, how the population's doing. And we kind of, from that, we generalize, like, okay, was it a successful season? Like, how did they do versus not? Last year, we had a lot of rain and foggy days mixed with less than ideal fish species being brought in that were too big for the chicks to eat. And so unfortunately last year there was a lot of mortality on the island. I think we only had about maybe like a 30 to 40% success rate across the whole island of chicks reaching fledgling. But this year they're doing a lot better. We haven't seen a whole lot of mortality across the island. There is the traditional mortality that is, like, typical that we would expect to see. But for the most part, they're doing pretty good. I mean, we definitely have seen some fish species being brought in that are less than ideal, but the parents seem to be compensating by bringing more fish in. So it's not too bad this year. It's definitely a lot better than last year. So hopefully that answers your question.
And are the bands monitored? When they fly away, how are the bands tracked and monitored?
Right. So within the Gulf of Maine, there are obviously several islands that are monitored for the seabirds. And so we have a whole database where every band is kept recorded. And so from there, any of the researchers from any island can recite a band and put it into the database. And that's our way of tracking these bands from, like, season to season. So, like, there's bands that we recited this year that were also recited last year. Or in some instances, you'll have a band that hasn't been seen in several years, which is always really exciting. And we've even had a couple instances where bands, haven't been read in over 10 years, but we captured the adult, had it in hand, confirmed the band, and pretty much unretired that band from the database.
Caitlin, where do they go in the winter when they're not on the island?
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, so it depends on the species. So the common terns, they go down to Chile or Argentina, which is actually the shorter of the flights. Because the Arctic terns will go down all the way to the Antarctic Circle and spend the winter there.
I think there was a question in the chat.
Okay. Do the terns nest on the same island every year? Yeah, the terns are pretty, the terns have strong site fidelity is what we call that. They'll nest on the same, usually on the same island, but also sometimes in basically the same spot. We deployed several GPS transmitters on terns this summer, and at those nests, we've actually put rocks with numbers painted on them for the techs next year who will come in and know to watch specifically in those areas, because it's very likely those adults will come back to that same spot. Okay, so I think we're good to move on to our guillemots, if you guys think so. Yeah.
What's the guillemot? You want to grab the guillemot?
Yeah, I can go.
So our next species are the black guillemots, which are in the alcid family, which are the same as like puffins. And so we actually have one nesting in the colony here, which Andreas is gonna do what we call grubbing, which is literally reaching your hands into the rocks and pulling them to get very big. Usually it is a 2-clutch, 2-egg nest, but this year his sibling, the egg broke, so he is just a single sibling. And in some instances, we actually have burrows that we can't fully reach our hands into. And so we have this lovely, what we call our chick hook. And so at the very end, there's a slight little hook, which we would gently wrap around. I see its foot. Gently wrap around its legs and be able to very gently pull this bird out and be able to grab them. But with these guys, we visit their burrows every 4 to 5 days. And like the terns, we weigh them and take their wing cord. So this guy's already starting to get his adult feathers in, but still very fluffy. I'm slightly biased, but they are one of my favorites on the island. But unlike the terns, they are quite chunky, and so the adults will dive down deep into the water to fetch their food, which their primary prey is rock gunnel, which is almost like a red eel looking fish. And so because of that, their poop is generally kind of red, and you have to watch out because since we usually pull them out by their feet, they like to projectile poop. Andreas got a little on his hand, so definitely something to be on the watch out for. Definitely poop around this island a lot.
Another way that these babies are a bit different than the terns is that when the terns first hatch, their like first day out of the egg, their legs are big enough for us to band them. For these guys, not so much. We have to wait until they weigh over 100 grams to band them. And so before that, like this guy obviously is old enough, has already gotten his band, but we want, and especially in nests that have 2 chicks, we want to be able to recognize which chick is the A chick, the one hatched first, and which chick is the B chick, the one hatched second. And so we actually paint their toes with nail polish. So A chicks get to be bright pink and B chicks get to be neon green. And so when we have a nest with chicks that are too small to be banded, the first thing we do is look at their toenails to identify them.
Which surprisingly stays on very well. And about it as if they're not getting a free pedicure. So don't know why they complain so much, but I think it's just because they're used to darkness and we pull them out to the bright light. Are there any questions about our guillemots here?
Why do you say they're your favorite, Caitlin?
I think personally, so obviously it's still very fluffy, but when they first hatch, they're just these tiny little fluff balls, and they're quite dramatic. A lot of times they you know, this guy's squeaking a little bit, but they'll kind of like screech at you and try and bite you. Not that it hurts, but they act very tough and aggressive, and instead of it looking scary, it just looks adorable. So it's like, oh, you're very cute. Like, you're trying to be scary. It's just so that's why they're my favorite.
Where do
And
they?
so the adults, once they grow bigger, they'll be a solid black, except for their wings, which will have white patches. It'll end up, you can kind of see where white is slowly starting to come in on the wings. And then they'll also have these bright red feet. So they almost look like they have little clown shoes on. And then the adults, although it's hard to see from water, if you have them in hand, which unfortunately, once the chicks are older, adults more just visit the burrow to deliver food. But the adults actually had this deep green iridescence kind of on their head. Is pretty nice to see, pretty cool.
Caitlin, where do they go in the winter when they're not on the island?
She was asking where they go in the winter.
These guys, the ones that breed this far south tend to not go very far at all. They're considered like mostly resident species. And so they don't do any type of long distance migration. The ones that breed very far north in the Arctic Circle, they do come down south a little bit, but again, not that much. If you ever watch these guys fly, you can tell that they're very heavy birds. Like the adult guillemots compared to the adult terns, the guillemots weigh over 3 times as much. And they have very short, stubby wings compared to the adults. Compared to the terns, very like long. Guillemots are really just not made for very long flights.
And they cohabit very well. There's no problems with the different species.
Right, so I guess we'll put this guy back in his burrow and we'll kind of head off to go look at petrels, which during that time, if there's any just general questions, we can go ahead and answer those while we take a walk out to look in a petrel burrow.
Caitlin, do all the birds on the island get along, all living and breeding in the same space?
So for the most part, the guillemots will nest along the rocky coast, so they don't have a whole lot of interaction. But there are the couple that do nest in the colony will occasionally the terns will slightly attack them as if they're not there all the time, which doesn't make sense. But the terns themselves, for the most part, will get along. Sometimes if there's someone in their space, like if a chick has wandered too far into another tern's nesting area, or same for an adult getting too close, there may be a mini fight, not necessarily a fight, but just a little rough and tumble, just get out of my way kind of thing, but it's not very aggressive. And then the gulls also will be further down away from the colony, so we don't have to worry about them in terms of issues. And then with the petrels being nocturnal, they don't have much interaction with the other species.
Caitlin, I have a question.
Sure.
So do y'all ever see any impact from avian influenza, or is there a way to determine that?
So we actually have found this season, we have confirmed AI on the island, unfortunately. So for the most part, it is staying out of the tern colony, but it is affecting some of the other species here on the island. For us personally, we are taking precautions with that. We have sampled several species, several different adults that we have found dead, washed up along the shore, and they have come back positive. And so in that case, we have been using protective gear, masks, gloves, lots of hand washing, and those birds have been removed from the island. Unfortunately, there's not much preventative stuff we can do with the terns themselves. We usually carry totes to put the chicks in. So in between plots, we try and clean out the tote. We use different bags for weighing different groups of chicks, but that's about as far as we can get in terms of preventative measures.
What is it specifically that you do test? I mean, is it like an oral swab or what?
Have set for 2 different tests. So we're able to do oral swabs and cloacal swabs. And then we
Our connection on the island is usually pretty good, but it does depend on the spot. So we might have tested fate by crossing. But so we're at our petrel burrow. And so this burrow, we already used a burrow scope to look down into it. So the storm petrels, unlike the guillemots, will actually dig their burrow. So this burrow starts in the wood and then goes down into the ground. And we have our handy burrow scope here. So this is a camera here, and then we can connect it to our phones, and we basically stick that down into a burrow to try and see what we can see. And so here's Caitlin. And so earlier when we looked into this burrow, we did not find an adult, but we did find a chick. And so we're hoping to grab that guy out. And so the storm petrels, unlike the other species we work with here, they have a clutch of a single egg, and they incubate that egg for around a month and a half before it hatches. And these chicks take a very long time to grow up. So while the terns will be done breeding in early August, the storm petrels will still be here in October raising these chicks. And so storm petrels are in the tube nose family, which is the same family as albatrosses. And you can see the start of this guy's tube nose on his beak. And so that will help them when they spend months out at sea without seeing land and drink only salt water. It's a fancy way to extract the salt from the water they drink. This guy's very young. Yeah, you can see his little webbed feet. The storm petrels here are one of my favorite species that we work with. We hear them a lot at night, especially because some of them actually nest under our house. So we'll hear them chattering.
And so something kind of distinct about the storm petrels, since they do nest in the ground, one way that you can sort of determine if a burrow is fresh or not is you can almost kind of smell the ground in the burrow. And there's this very distinct like earthiness to it that, although it's hard to explain, like once you smell it, you're like, oh yeah, that's just the smell of a petrel. So it's pretty cool. We're gonna go ahead, since this guy is so young and new to the world, we'll go ahead and stick him back in his little burrow so he's not out in the wind for too long.
And so another fun fact, so birds, like so many birds have long distance migrations, and so they have to be good navigators, but even compared to other birds, storm petrels and other tube noses are experts at navigation. And one of the ways they do that is actually by smell. They create what like current research is calling like an olfactory map. where they map out the world by smells. And that's part of how they manage to wander so far out to sea, only to return to the same breeding site the next summer. So I think that's a very cool fact. So we have the question, how common are the storm petrels on Metinic, and how large are the adult birds? So I'll answer the second part first. The adult birds are pretty small. They're, would you say, about the size of that guillemot chick, really?
Yeah, but not nearly as
Not,
big.
yeah, not nearly as hefty. Yeah, their wing tends to measure around like 130 millimeters. And on Metinic, they're like pretty common. So we go out and do nocturnal surveys for these guys, where we come out with a speaker and we walk the island near places where they nest and play their calls, and we see who answers us so we can flag any burrows. And when we do that, we usually say that we hear around like 90 to 100 storm petrels. Do you know how many burrows we've marked?
So this year we've marked probably close to probably almost near 100. Most of those are going to be in the rock wall, which are known areas that they like to nest. The hard thing with the rock wall, though, is that the way that the rocks are set up, you can't easily scope them. But a lot of the ones that are in the ground, so the ones in the forest, along the shoreline, and like this burrow here, you're a lot easier for us to access in terms of being able to monitor them for whether there's an adult, if there's an egg, and obviously if there's chicks, which this was actually the first chick found of the year. So congratulations to you guys. Not only is this the first time that I'm sure you guys are seeing petrels, but it's also the first time that I'm very exciting.
Yeah, one of the interesting things with storm petrels is that the leech's storm petrel populations in Canada aren't doing as well. And it seems like our storm petrel populations are doing just fine. So we're starting to look into like what differences are there, what might be causing the Canadian populations to drop while ours haven't been affected. But we're definitely glad that they're doing so well here. Any other questions on storm petrels?
Becca, if an adult abandons its burrow for some reason, what happens to the chick?
So, in the case of like the chicks wouldn't be able to survive on their own, but in terms of abandonment with birds, like when a bird, like birds put a lot of effort into their nests, and so they wouldn't want to abandon a nest that they've put a lot of effort into. So if the storm petrel comes to a burrow and they start digging it and they're like, I think this is where I want to nest, and like somebody came by then and disturbed it, then they might abandon that. But if they've already been in that burrow for months and they've incubated an egg for 2.5 months and now it's a chick, the only reason they would leave that burrow is if that chick's gone. In the case of this guy, why we didn't like this burrow, why we didn't find an adult, it's very possible the adult is further in the burrow than we can get to. So we have another question, which is, are those leeches storm petrels? My old Peterson guide says that a storm petrel is unusual in Maine. And these are leeches storm petrels. Do you guys know much about why a guide would have it?
It could just be, I'm not sure why the guide would, it could just be that this may be like the lower extent for the leeches storm petrels breeding range. So that could potentially be why the borough or the guide is out of date. But here in Maine, we have both the Leeches Storm Petrels, which we just had, as well as the Wilson's Storm Petrels. I'm not sure if the Wilsons breed here. Occasionally see them out at sea during the day, low on the water surface.
I'll give you guys some nice views of the island as we walk back. We do have a little bit of forest on the island and also some nesting songbirds here this season. So far, we've confirmed red-breasted nuthatches breeding here, northern parulas, black-throated green warblers, as well as like savanna sparrows and song sparrows. And also on the songbird side, we actually know that this island is the stopover site for millions of songbirds in the spring. There was somebody here who did some past research on that and set up mist nets to see what kind of songbirds come through. And the answer is a lot of them. But we also have some cool species show up here, like we had a black-billed cuckoo last week.
Did you guys get to see the tufted puffin?
We have not gotten to see the tufted puffin, which we're all very sad about. We keep hearing that Metinic Island could be next for it, but so far it's only gone on islands with other nesting puffins, which we don't have here.
So are they finding a lot of insects on this island, the songbirds? Must be a lot of insects.
So are there a lot of insects out on the island for the songbirds to be eating?
Are there a lot of insects on the island for the songbirds to be eating?
Yeah, there should be a good number of insects. I mean, I know I see a lot of birds flying around, swooping and getting insects. I've seen a lot of like small little caterpillars that have been carried by adults, and I know I definitely every now and then get a good mosquito bite. So, and even sometimes the terns will, when they're struggling to find fish, they'll actually bring back various insects. I've had some chicks started to eat ants on their own. So there definitely are a variety of insects for nesting songbirds.
How are the monarchs this year? The monarchs on the island, it seems like they're all over the place. Like you can compare it to past years, but I see them every single day.
Yeah, I'd say we probably have more than last year. We do have one patch that this near our well of milkweed that the staff have slowly been growing over the years. And then like on other parts of the island, there are small little clumps of milkweed for the monarchs.
Yeah, why don't puffins nest on Metinic?
Do what?
Why don't puffins nest on Metinic?
So a lot of times the puffins like to nest under large rocky boulders, and while the rock line that we have is sufficient enough for the guillemots, they're not the kind of structure that the puffins use. I know sometimes they will like dig into the ground. I know in Petite Manan, they have some that burrow into the ground as well. But it's also just the staff haven't, or the refuge, because there's so many other islands that are very successful with the puffins, there hasn't been a big push to try and establish a puffin colony here. But we have had several flying by this year and have even seen a couple of razorbills. So even though we don't have them nesting, we do get to see them as they're out foraging from other islands like Metinic Rock, which is about 45 minutes from here.
Going a bit off that, one thing that I think is pretty neat is Maine Coastal Islands owns a lot of islands, and there's certainly tons of islands up the Maine coast. But so basically when they were establishing these tern colonies, like there were some breeding terns around, but they really were looking at islands and going like, where do we want to attract these birds? And so things that they would look at were like what predators were coming to the island. Like some island have a lot of mink come that can just decimate tern populations. And so I find it very interesting that kind of looking at that active management and how they've tried to make it so they've only selected islands that are good for breeding and had did their best to bring the terns there, but while also trying to spread out the populations enough so that if something happened at one island, that it wouldn't completely decimate the tern populations here.
There's been a lot of questions about the birds and, you know, wildlife species on the island, but what is it like as a biologist living on an island for months on end without coming off?
Oh, yeah, I can take that one. It by living on the island, it really allows us to like invest in our work and really be a part of the colony and watch them grow throughout the season. Since we work almost every day and throughout the entire summer, we watch them come in, lay eggs, and then feed the chicks, and eventually at the end of the season fly away. And so we really get to a personal connection with the colony, and basically repetition too with collecting data. We get to do some of the same stuff every day, and so it really gets us to get good at some of the stuff that we do here.
For me too, it's very cool getting to live so close to the colony, because it really is like, if it's like 6 p.m. and we're done with our work for the day, and then like we suddenly hear the terns get up, like all of us are like, what's going on? Like, what's bothering the terns? Which is neat. I think I saw something in the chat.
There was a question.
When you arrive on the island, do you help move the sheep to the other end?
So Becca and Andreas, unfortunately, were not able to be out here at the start of the season, but I was here and did help the staff move sheep to the other side of the island. So for those of you who don't know, on the southern end of the island is privately owned, and that family has a herd of about 120 sheep. And so throughout the year, they are allowed to roam wherever they want on the island, and that's a way. And their grazing the colony is one of the management, like vegetation managements that are in play. And so, but once the terns arrive, we don't want them in the colony because they'll just walk around stepping on eggs, accidentally eating eggs and potentially chicks. And so, and the terns just constantly swoop and dive at them, and the sheep, it doesn't bother them. So at the beginning of the season, a large number of staff come out and we just herd all the sheep to the southern end and have a fence that runs the width of the island. And so for the most part, that does a really good job. In recent years, including this year, some of the sheep have figured out a way around. As far as we can tell, since the fence is pretty intact itself and there's never any obvious signs of a breakthrough, we believe that they're at very low tide walking out on the rocks and kind of just scooting around the edge of the fence, because that's the only thing that we can figure. So there's definitely been a couple times where it's late at night where you look out the window and it's like, oh God, the sheep are in the colonies. And you got to run out and try and shoo them away back into the woods. So thankfully, it hasn't been nearly as bad this year as it was last year. Last year, we had to do 4:30 a.m. wake-up calls to be on sheep patrol. So this year, they've been pretty good about coming around dinner time. So we're already all around the house and can easily get out and scare them away.
I think I saw another comment. So, how many of you live on the island during the summer?
So Starting last year, the refuge staff began having 3 of us out on the island. In previous years, it was just 2 people, but for the past 2 years, since the colony itself is growing, which means the responsibilities and the duties that we have to do between the terns, the guillemots, and the petrels, since all of those duties are increasing, the refuge decided it would be, after multiple recommendations from previous workers recommending that there should be more people on the island, they've began staffing 3 of us out here for the season, so that way we can get more work done more successfully. So I saw there was a question about the weather. So that kind of varies from season to season. This year, it's been very dry on the island. We've gotten very little rain this season, which has actually been, obviously, I mean, the island itself is pretty dry, which I'm sure the island would like some rain, but it's great for the terns. Last season, we had Hurricane Elsa, or post-tropical storm Elsa, as well as a lot of other rain events, which caused a lot of hypothermia and unfortunately death among the terns. So this year it's been a lot nicer weather, so the chicks have been doing really well.
Does the solar panel support all your electrical needs?
Yeah, I can take that. So yeah, the solar panels work great for, so our house is fully lit. We're able to charge the computer, which we use for all of our data input, as well as our own personal devices. And then in terms of, so that's all of the really electrical needs that we have in the house. As for the refrigerator and the stove, that's all propane. So we don't end up having too much of an electrical usage, but even last year when there was a lot of fog and rain, we had no problem and never really had any issues of running out of power.